Greetings, Writing Art Criticism students. Welcome to week number 2. I hope that you enjoyed your weekend, and I'm looking forward to the time that we have together throughout this week. This week we are looking at this week we're looking at different ways of writing about art. As I've mentioned before, and an important theme it's an important theme throughout this class is that modern art criticism is a particular way of writing about art that developed in the modern period, developed under the conditions, cultural, social conditions of modernity, in order to respond to certain changes in artistic practice. And I've also mentioned that art criticism is not merely offering a consumer report, a thumbs up or a thumbs down, what shows to go see, what art is good or not, offering a judgment, a universal judgment, that it is something more. And it's something more in part because the visual arts, particularly in the modern period, are working with emotions and subjective responses. And so they require a subjective and emotional engagement on the part of the viewer, on the listener, on the reader, on the audience member in a play. And so there are different ways of experiencing the work of art. And for those who write about it, who think about it and write about it for an audience, there are different ways of expressing that, which will mean that it will look as though there aren't any standards, that anybody can write anything about a work of art, and it doesn't really matter. Now, it suggests to you on one hand, as we will explore this, that there is a particular grain of truth in that, and that particular grain of truth is frustrating to us, but it's also liberating, and it's liberating in part because it is an expression of our human subjective particularity, and that's what the arts offer. The world is not merely, knowledge about the world is not merely recounted in scientific, empirical, or abstract conceptualizations, discursive statements, truth claims, 2 + 2 = 4, the kinds of universal right and wrong that we think the world operates within. And that the arts reveal different ways of knowing the world through feeling and emotion, through intuition, through aesthetic experience. It's something that the Romantics, the German Romantics in the late 18th century were responding to and trying to understand how the role of reason and cognition can be a part of how we know the world, but then also how our aesthetic experience reveals other aspects of the world. But in terms of writing about art, in terms of what we say about a work of art, there are different ways in the history of Western culture, there's different ways of writing about art that don't necessarily qualify within the modern paradigm of art criticism. And this week's readings will will give you some examples. We'll start with Pliny the Elder, one of the great classical Latin scholars. In his Natural History, writes about the Greek painters. Now, he has no evidence of these paintings or these works of art. No evidence whatsoever. He has stories and recollections, and so he's telling them. And the fact that the visual arts are operating within the context of natural history and within the context, as you will notice, in chapters on minerals and stones, is that the artist works with those materials. That painting is ground up pigment, ground up minerals and stone, and sculpture works with marble, works with natural materials that are transformed. Also have an example of one of the earliest pre-modern writers, often said as the founder of art history, Giorgio Vasari, the Mannerist, late Renaissance Mannerist painter in Florence, who was also a theorist, who was telling the story of the development and the birth of Renaissance painting, Renaissance visual arts in Italy, and his chapter on Giotto. And I want you to pay attention to it in terms of the narrative structure that he uses for articulating the significance of Giotto, and we will have opportunity to discuss it probably in my video chat at the end of the week, or next week when I'm responding to your discussion prompts. I'll talk a little bit more about that structure. And then there are other ways, writing about art within the context of philosophy. And I have an example of a review that I wrote of a book by the critic and philosopher David Carrier on the philosophical art criticism of Rosalind Krauss, in which I talk about different ways of writing about art. Michael Fried, an art historian and a practicing critic who was working, who understands his work as an art historian and as an art critic in different ways. He has a tremendously revealing introduction to his collected writings, his collected art criticism, in which he differentiates and distinguishes between art history, the work that he does in terms of historical work with Edward Manet and Caravaggio and Courbet and the modernists of the 19th century, and the work that he was doing in terms of writing about contemporary art in New York in the 1960s. Also, Merleau-Ponty writes about Paul Cézanne. Merleau-Ponty, as a French phenomenologist, is writing not as an art critic, not writing for individuals who are necessarily interested in art, an art audience, but is using art and using an artist as a particular way of revealing something about human experience that he is considering philosophically. And then I've included a chapter on art criticism in a book I wrote a number of years ago called God in the Gallery, in which I articulate this concept of modern art criticism. And it'll be a chapter I think that could be helpful, that we can continue to revisit throughout the weeks ahead. I've had a great time responding to you. This is a class that I am always energized and challenged by, because it's a subject that I'm always thinking about. And when we are talking about art and judgment and experience, it's going to open up into areas of ethics and morals and faith and religion. And so we move very quickly into a lot of those subjects. And I've just had a great time. I want to continue to encourage you to move in that direction if you're so inclined. And the work that I've done for 25 years is motivated by the basic question: what is it that I can say about a work of art? Can I say anything? Can I say everything? Can I say, does it matter? Is a work of art simply a Rorschach test in which I impose my own views on it? And so those are questions that we'll be looking at. One of the things that I find that is really interesting and important to keep in mind is that there's a lot of talk, a lot of discourse in the world these days, commentary on politics, commentary on sports, but commentary on the arts is different. And it's because of the nature of the cultural practice. We can discuss, and we will spend months and months and months discussing the aftermath of the midterm elections. But that discussion isn't going to change the result. Or we'll spend the next week discussing the demise or the victory of our football team this past week, and it won't do anything to change the result. The scoreboard always remains the same. However, with the visual arts, or with the arts, it's not the case. You may read a review of a poem or a novel or an artist's work that unlocks something for you that will change the scoreboard, that will move you from not being interested in the writing of David Foster Wallace to being interested in the writing of David Foster Wallace, to not being interested in the paintings of Paul Cézanne, to being interested in the paintings of Paul Cézanne. That opens up dimensions in which you are able to understand and experience the work in different ways. And that in a lot of areas, that can be very frustrating for us, because what we want to do is we want to have the categories we can apply. Well, this is a good work of art, this is a bad work of art. This stands for truth, this stands for falsehood, this is beauty, this is not beauty. But I also want you to keep in mind just what the nature of beauty is. For example, beauty isn't a universal category. Beauty always takes us by surprise. We can say, what's the formula for beauty? And philosophers have thought about that. Kant and Thomas Aquinas and Plato and Aristotle and others have thought about what beauty is as an abstract formula. But beauty always seems to frustrate that. Take a case in point. You can say, what's an attractive man or woman? You say, well, an attractive man or woman, a beautiful man or woman has these qualities. You say, okay, A, B, C, and D qualities. But then there's a man or woman that comes into the room, and you're taken aback, and you say, that's a beautiful man, or that's a handsome man, or that's a beautiful woman. But he or she doesn't have those qualities. You say, well, we'll add those other qualities on. What I would suggest to you is that beauty is never expected, it's never formulaic, and it always takes us by surprise. So if that's the case in terms of human beings, how about works of art? Now, cognition, discourse, theory, abstract concepts, all those things are very important tools. But they get us to a point, they can get us only to a particular point, or they can only help us dig deeper into what was already initiated in terms of our heart and our experience. So I leave you with that. With those comments, have a great week, and I will be back in touch with you at the end of the week to comment on and respond to some of the accumulated comments and observations and insights in last week's discussion prompts that I'll be reading through. Again, write me with any questions. Take care.